Good morning, friends. Welcome to another morning discussing the Bhagavad Gita. You may have noticed from the title of today's talk, we are going to discuss an extremely important and beautiful part of the Gita today. And I want to start with one of Yoganandaji's cosmic chants. I was thinking of which chant would be appropriate for today morning. This one came to me. This particular chant, Yoganandaji sings to Divine Mother, but he says, this chant draws to us the experience of God as cosmic light, which in essence is some of what we are going to look at today. So let's start with this chant of Yoganandaji. Let's take a brief moment of meditation now on that melody and those words of Yoganandaji, which he sang from a state of awareness of Divine Mother's presence, of her experience as that lightning flash. Good morning, friends. As I already mentioned, today we are going to discuss an extremely beautiful part of the Bhagavad Gita. This is what traditionally in India we refer to as the Vishwarupa of Krishna. Krishna revealing his cosmic form to Arjuna. And this is the 11th chapter of Gita. As I already mentioned last week, these two chapters, the 10th and the 11th, I'm approaching them a little bit differently. I've been picking individual verses of the Gita or sometimes a couple of verses of the Gita to discuss the ideas presented by Krishna, to discuss their deeper meaning and how they're relevant to us. But these two chapters are rather unique. I'm not quite sure if they deserve or require a philosophical explanation or treatise, because all these verses that we have been looking so far, except last week in particular, these are verses where there are ideas Krishna is presenting, where he's teaching Arjuna, and we are also discussing, and it's important for us to understand how they apply in our own lives. But in these verses, Krishna is revealing his consciousness. They're vibrational. I think I already mentioned that last week as well. And this particular chapter is beyond beautiful. You know, Krishna is finally revealing to Arjuna his own form. He himself being an avatar, Arjuna is able to have this experience of Krishna. You can think of it as Arjuna having this high state of samadhi, of union with the infinite, where he has revealed these cosmic secrets, not again as a mental idea or a thought form, but as a true vibrational experience that lifts Arjuna himself into that state of being. So it is in fact a beautiful part of Gita that deserves our meditation, that deserves our constant remembrance of what God truly is. You know, we often talk in spiritual life, we talk about the difference between belief and faith. You know, how we have to cultivate faith, and belief alone is not enough. Belief, what I mean by belief is when you say you believe in something, you're referring to a thought form, you're referring to an affirmative thought of committing to something. Whereas faith is more than that. Faith is an awareness, it's born out of experience. It is an awareness of something that we know to be true. It is more than a mere thought form. It is something that is deeply imbibed in our own consciousness. Like, for example, I think of this example, when I think of the word faith, you imagine or visualize your own toes in your feet. It's not a belief that you're always connected to your toes, even if you're not moving them or even if you're not working or touching with them. You're aware, you live with this realization that the toes are part of you, of who you are. Now, I don't know if that's a perfect example, but it helps communicate that point of what true faith is, and that is born out of realization, that is born out of experience, and it is built on that bedrock of understanding that cannot be shaken. And oftentimes we wonder, we pray on how we can develop faith. We are asked to develop faith in God. And how do we develop faith in God? How do we experience God so that what we know to be true is unshakable, is so deeply rooted in our understanding and awareness? Can we see God? Can we hear His voice? Can God come to me? How can God reveal His presence to me? And the answer to that question is both yes and no. Yes, we can see God, but not in the way we can imagine. Yes, we can hear God's voice, but not necessarily in the way we hear everything else in this world. Because God cannot be perceived through those glasses of duality, through those eyes of duality. What we perceive in this world, how we interact on this material plane, is always through that lens of duality, of up and down, of pleasure and pain, and God does not exist on that plane. So for God to be perceived, God to be seen, we have to pull ourselves away from that plane of duality. So that experience is different. It's not that we are walking on the streets and somebody comes in front of us and says he's God, or that we are suddenly listening to something and we hear another voice telling us and we know that it's the voice of God. It's not as mundane or as superfluous as sometimes the sensory experiences can be, whereas it is a true experience. It is tangible in that same way, but it is happening on a whole other dimension. We experience it on a whole other level because we are receiving it on the level of consciousness. And in this chapter, we begin with Arjuna asking Krishna to reveal his cosmic form. Of course, who wouldn't? And Swami Kriyananda, in this particular chapter of Gita, he offers almost no commentary. He just simply presents the translation of the verses, which in itself is interesting. I'm not quite sure what I can say to that. I mean, say to these verses, because there's not a lot that can be said in form of explanation. But I'll read some of the translation of the verses, which I think are beautiful and they're worth contemplating on. So this is Krishna in response to Arjuna when Arjuna asks Krishna for this cosmic experience to reveal Krishna's form to him. One of the first things that Krishna says, "You cannot behold me with mortal eyes. Now therefore I give you divine sight. Behold my supreme power." Now, at this point in the Gita, interestingly, throughout the entire Gita, except the first chapter, the first few verses of the Gita, where we see these two characters, Dhritarashtra and Sanjaya, having this conversation, you might remember this from our previous episodes. Pretty much there's no other party having a voice in the Bhagavad Gita. It is a conversation between Krishna and Arjuna. And this point, as soon as Krishna says this and he starts revealing himself, immediately we have Dhritarashtra and Sanjaya talking to each other. And that in itself is an interesting contrast from everything else happening in the Gita, because all aspects are beholding this cosmic vision, all aspects of our own consciousness. As we already know what these characters are symbolic of. Dhritarashtra represents the mind, Sanjaya represents the faculty of introspection, Arjuna is the seed of that will to uplift, to seek God, and Krishna throughout the Gita is playing the role of the guru, but in essence he is playing the role of that intuitive guidance present within our own soul. So these are the major players, of course. We have also seen a lot of other characters while describing the meaning of some of these verses. But these are the four characters who actually have a voice in the Bhagavad Gita. And after the first two verses, we never encountered Dhritarashtra and Sanjaya. But again, we see the two of them, because as Krishna is presenting his form, the entire being of Arjuna, entire being of the devotee is beholding this cosmic vision. So Sanjaya, Dhritarashtra, all of them are astounded. They're completely shaken by this vision. Sanjaya is obviously seeing it also. I mean, I'm talking about the literal story of the Mahabharata, because Sanjaya is watching what's happening in the battlefield and reporting it to Dhritarashtra. And that faculty of introspection is also beholding this cosmic vision. And going back to what Krishna talks about, the divine side, it's important for us to understand the contrast here, because sometimes the literal story, I was meditating on this today morning and it came to me, it can be a little confusing, because you imagine Krishna as the Superman, and Arjuna is asking Krishna to reveal his form, and immediately Krishna takes off his shirt and shows who he is. Now, that is often how this episode is depicted, but it is important for us to understand that Krishna was always who he was. Krishna is who he is. The transformation is not happening in Krishna, it is happening in Arjuna. It is Arjuna's vision which is being opened to this cosmic vision. And Krishna, through the grace of Krishna, Arjuna is able to open up his own vision. And it is an important contrast for us to understand, because this state of samadhi, this state of cosmic consciousness is not oftentimes, when you see depictions of Mahabharata in film or in drama, you see that these two characters are having a conversation, and immediately Arjuna is just completely taken by surprise because Krishna is doing something. It is charming to see it that way, because God is playing this role, God is revealing himself, but also the transformation is not happening in God, the transformation is happening in the devotee. Arjuna is the one, after these experiences, when he is finally ready, when he is received with absolute attunement and receptivity all that Krishna has been giving to him these first 10 chapters, and then with that right attitude and absolute devotion and humility, when he approaches Krishna for this experience, Krishna is able to reveal that to him, because Arjuna himself is open. And that is why Krishna starts by saying, "Now I give you divine sight." It's not that I'm going to become something else, but now you are going to have this divine sight with which you can truly see and cognize who I am. And there are a lot of parallels between this particular chapter of the Gita and correct me if I'm wrong, or I apologize, I didn't look up before I started. I think it is chapter 14 of the autobiography of a yogi, where Yogananda himself has that experience in cosmic consciousness, where Yogananda, who has been seeking this experience, of course, Yogananda in that book, also in his own life story, he was playing this Leela of being a seeker, not necessarily always being the avatar who he was born as. Now, Yogananda in that story is constantly seeking that divine experience. First, he tries to run away to the Himalayas. That is not as successful. Then he pesters and he's constantly going and knocking at the doors of Master Mahashaya, who was a disciple of Ramakrishna, asking him for this experience of cosmic consciousness. And Master Mahashaya does give him some experiences. He's able to open up Yogananda's consciousness to certain aspects of Divine Mother and certain ways in which he can transcend the material plane. And yet he's not able to give that final experience of cosmic consciousness, because he again and again tells Yogananda, your guru is about to come and he will be the one who will give you this experience. And finally, Yogananda does meet Swami Sri Yukteswar. And interestingly, somewhere in there, Yogananda actually leaves the ashram. He actually goes back again. He goes in search of Ramagopal Mazumdar. It's not all that clear when you read the AY what exactly happens and how it is all chronologically placed. But Yogananda, even after recognizing his guru, is so desperately seeking the experience of cosmic consciousness that he sometimes leaves his guru and walks around looking for it elsewhere, looking for it in the Himalayan mountains, looking for it in other saints. And finally, he realizes, he comes back to his guru, he comes back to Serampore, to Yukteswarji's ashram, and he realizes that this is where I can find what I've been looking for. What mountains, as Yukteswar says in the autobiography of a yogi, what an inert mountain could not give him. He finally realizes that his guru is the only source that can offer to him this cosmic state of awareness. So he starts humbly serving Yukteswarji, and after he has had all these experiences, all these adventures and ups and downs, one fine morning, he is meditating, and he himself writes in the autobiography of a yogi, it's not even one of those particularly deep meditations. It's not even a time when he could claim that he was having this deep state of realization or awareness of God's presence. He says his mind, it was ruffled like leaves on the wind. That's how I think he describes it. And at that time, Yukteswarji calls him and he taps him on his chest and immediately reveals to him this cosmic state of consciousness, this state of samadhi. There's so many lessons in that episode. I won't go into all of them, but there's a lot of similarities between that experience that Yoganandaji has with Swami Sri Yukteswar Giri and this experience that Arjuna is having with Krishna, because it is that state of samadhi as soon as the devotee is ready. In fact, there is another story that Swami Kriyananda shared often with us. One of Yoganandaji's very advanced disciples, somebody who had been with him all through his life from his very first days in the United States, he often approached Yoganandaji asking for this cosmic state of consciousness. And this person had been with Yoganandaji longer than Rajarshi or James Lynn, who was Yoganandaji's most advanced disciple. And Yoganandaji often casually referred to how Rajarshi was often in high states of samadhi. So all the disciples knew that Rajarshi was swimming in ecstasy all the time. And this other disciple approached Yoganandaji asking for that same state. Can you also give me the state? And as Swami Kriyananda put it, this devotee kept approaching Yoganandaji again and again through many occasions, asking for that experience. And finally one day, Yoganandaji just looked at this person and said, will you be able to take this experience if I gave you? And immediately this disciple, we should give him credit for that, he immediately realized that no, I won't be, because this cup is not ready to hold that ocean. So he realizes that he himself is not ready for that state of samadhi. So in these verses we see that progression of that individual seeker, of that devotee finally being receptive enough, and God in the form of Guru, in the form of Krishna, being able to give, to be able to bestow that divine sight on him. And these are, I think, words of Sanjaya, where he says, "Were 1,000 suns to appear together in the sky, their brilliance could suggest only dimly the splendor of that exalted being." This section of the Gita is extremely poetic and beautiful. That's why it almost does not deserve an explanation in that sense. It's just worth enjoying simply for its poetic beauty. And Swami Kriyananda also, he does not provide a literal translation of the verses. He does translate all the ideas presented by Krishna, but he doesn't go verse by verse, because as he describes here, the Gita as it's written in Sanskrit, I'm not going to read the whole section, there are a lot of verses here. The Gita is so poetic in nature. It is presenting all these imageries of this experience that Arjuna is having, because this experience is one of feeling. So poetry is the best way to express it. So in order to stay in tune with it, Swami Kriyananda also writes this whole section as poetry. Interestingly, one of the most well-known translations of the Gita, which I think Master referred to sometimes, and Yoganandaji also, Swamiji also read it before he wrote his own, is Sir Edwin Arnold. It's, I don't know what it's called. I think it's called the Song Celestial or something like that. And Sir Edwin Arnold, also his whole commentary is poetic in nature, but especially this particular section, even if you do not have or do not find Swami Kriyananda's commentary, Sir Edwin Arnold's is also almost equally beautiful. So you can easily find it on the internet. You can look for his translation of chapter 11 of the Gita, and you can see this lucid poetry with which he describes Arjuna's experience. Soon Arjuna himself is going to start marveling and describing in his own words what he's experiencing, just as Yoganandaji described his experience of cosmic consciousness in that beautiful poem Samadhi. So now Arjuna, I'm going to read some of Arjuna's words. Let's jump into the verses themselves. "Most wonderful Lord, adored of gods, within thy cosmic form I behold the vast universe of beings, saints and sages divine, sequestered in remote caves, their serpent nature, formerly virulent, now tamed, raised by love on the rod of awakening." I'm going to move on. This is a pretty long section. I'm going to read some of my favorite parts. "I behold thee everywhere and in everything. Innumerable bodies, faces, eyes reveal thy energy. Inscrutable to me are your origins, your reigns, your endings, your blazing effulgence, overwhelming light. The glory of thy name spreads everywhere to darkest corners of the universe." Another thing I would strongly recommend searching on Google is you can search for Krishna's cosmic form or Vishwarupa, and you would see all these beautiful paintings of this image depicted by many artists. Of course, it is such an abstraction of what that true experience is, but still I find those images very beautiful, where Krishna is depicted with these hundreds of faces, with hundreds of arms, performing all the aspects of creation, and just fire flowing out of one of his faces. You see all the different gods and goddesses depicted in all those different faces, and Arjuna is standing as this tiny little like a fly or an ant at his feet, and Krishna is this huge expanded universal being that is revealing his form to him. It's such a beautiful image to meditate on. I'm going to skip some verses and move on. "The lights of heaven, blazing suns, the lamps of consciousness, hermits, sages, emperors of benign rule, noble heralds of thy peace, the strong, the powerful, the desire-filled, the ambitious, bow in wonder before thy radiant throne, or else fall before thee fear-filled, vanquish their petty lives consumed in thy cosmic fire. Thee I behold, thy feet walk everywhere, thy countless limbs are active throughout space, thy mouths are consuming, thy eyes flashing, thy hair streaming out with energy across the sky. O thou joyous, overpowering, all-obliterating light, I stand trembling before thee, awe-filled. Egos, karmas, desires, ambitions, victories, all rush toward thee for absorption in thy bliss, or else soon crumble into wasted dust. So do the rushing rivers of innumerable lives flow impetuously, blindly to thy sea. Moths drawn to a flame, there perish. So do human lives drawn by ambition, ever hopeful but ever doomed to devastation, the fog of passion obscuring from them the truth. Who art thou, Lord? What is thy cosmic will? What is thy purpose? To what end has all this been done? Wow. I mean, Arjuna's words themselves are so poetic, of course, Vyasa's expression of it, and also Swami Kriyananda's English translation. It's equally beautiful, just every word, every idea worth meditating on and just tuning into. Now I'm going to read a couple of interesting verses that follow them, which are Krishna's response to Arjuna. Again, these verses are also beautiful, where now Krishna is speaking to Arjuna. I am Kala, I am time. Disguised as endless doom, I come, I seize, I obliterate. Even were you not to fight, O Arjuna, these foes you gaze upon at Kurukshetra would perish, slain by my mighty will. Indeed, I slew them long ago. You are but my instrument. Your destiny is to carry out my will. I need you not. It is you, Arjuna, who have need of me. I know the past, present, and future of all men. Make war for me if you would embrace eternal life and victory and bliss. How beautiful. I'm going to move on. There are a couple of other verses I want to read in this chapter before finishing today morning's webinar. Now, of course, what Krishna is revealing to Arjuna is a very specific state of samadhi, of cosmic consciousness, and he himself says this is not an experience that any mortal has had before, and it is not one that comes easily. And interestingly, Arjuna, at the end of all of this, he says, overjoyed I am by this cosmic form never held before. Yet I confess my mind is not free from terror. Be merciful to me, O Lord of gods and shelter of the worlds. Show me thyself once again in thy limited human form. That is in itself an interesting request. That state of awareness that Krishna is trying to bestow to Arjuna, he is so blown away and overwhelmed by this vision and by the state of samadhi that Krishna himself requests to tone it down a little, Arjuna himself requests to tone it down a little bit so that he can again have that intimate relationship, that friendship with Krishna once again. I'm going to just read a couple of more verses before I finish for today. Let's see. Now at this point, Krishna reveals himself as Lord Vishnu first. Lord Vishnu is the preserving aspect in creation, and this particular aspect, the first state that Krishna revealed, was that cosmic form of this constantly expanding universe of time itself. Time is an interesting concept here because what Krishna is revealing to Arjuna is his own true nature. What is time when he says, I am Kala? The word Kala in Sanskrit in itself is very layered. Time is not just 1 second to another, not just its measurement in seconds or minute, but time is movement. Time is mutation, time is change, time is what expands the universe. Time is what defines every instant. That's what makes this instant different from the previous instant. And even before I can express it, it is the next instant. So it keeps this universe in a state of flux, in a state of growth. And this sustaining force is God, is that divine force. And that's really what Krishna is revealing to Arjuna. And that state is terrorizing. It's bewildering to Arjuna because that aspect of God is all obliterating. Not in the sense that we ourselves are destroyed, but time is a leveler. Time levels everything. Time moves everything. Time destroys everything in the sense that it changes the form of all things in creation and in nature. And then Krishna reveals himself to Arjuna as the form of Vishnu, as the preserving Lord, almost in a state of balancing that terror that Arjuna experienced by beholding that cosmic form of Krishna, because that benign form of the divine, which Krishna was able to reveal to Arjuna, is the form that most often devotees tune into, the one that is comforting and reassuring, and the one that is guiding and saving us from this ocean of delusion. And even Krishna goes further, and finally, Krishna, of course, comes back to Arjuna, has his own charioteer and cousin. And I think at some point there's a verse here that Arjuna says, oh, I think it's before I skip that one. It's a beautiful verse. It's the 41st verse where Arjuna says, "For whatever disrespect I may have shown thee in zest, addressing thee as friend, companion, Krishna, Yadava, speaking carelessly, although with affection, and for any reverence I may have shown thee, O unshakable Lord, light-heartedly while eating, resting, walking, when we were seated together, whether by ourselves or in the company of others. For all such unintended slights, I beg your forgiveness." The divine experience is so overwhelming. There's this beautiful quote. I'll end with that because we are out of time for this morning. I think it's a quote by this French saint, John Vianney, where he says, "If you knew how much God loved you, you would die of joy." And when you read these verses from Arjuna, you almost can understand that how you would literally die because that experience is beyond what the human mind can grasp or hold. That's truly what the 11th chapter is. So Arjuna is so overwhelmed by this experience of light and of this cosmic form of Krishna that he has to even apologize for acknowledging and treating him in that human form the way he did, although it was perfectly natural and normal. Because if we all knew, if Arjuna had known before, then he would have responded differently. And if we all knew now what God is, what God's light is, what God's love is, perhaps we would be responding to our own life situations differently. I would recommend and encourage all of you to tune into any commentary, any way in which you can, into the verses of this 11th chapter of Gita. It is truly a treasure and such a great scriptural treat that we all have, on which we can meditate and attune to the divine. I'll see you next week with another verse, probably from chapter 12. Until then, God bless you all.